The sound wasn't just a sound. It was a thief. It stole the night, the rain-slicked alley, the entire city of Northgate, and in their place, it left a world of blinding white and biting cold. One moment, Thea was walking home. The next, she was on her knees in a memory that wasn't hers. The smell of pine and cold air flooded her senses, sharp and clean and terrifyingly real. A guttural, wet snarling echoed in her ears, a sound that bypassed hearing and went straight to the soul. Predator. Then came the pain. A supernova of agony in her shoulder, so vivid, so absolute, she buckled, her hands flying to the spot. But then, just as quickly as it came, the vision shattered. She was back in the alley, on her hands and knees, the grimy pavement biting into her skin. Rain plastered strands of her dark hair to her face, mingling with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden roaring silence. Truth be told, the silence was worse than the snarling. The silence was where the questions lived. Moments later, she was fumbling with the keys to her apartment, her hands shaking so violently it was a small miracle she got the door open. She didn't bother with the lights. The sterile darkness of the small, empty room was a comfort, a blank canvas where no ghosts could linger. She slid down the door, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to remember how to breathe. Because of that constant, creeping fear, she had made her life as small as possible. The diner, the apartment, the alley in between. A tiny, repeatable loop where nothing new could get in. Yet the past kept finding the cracks. What's worse, the cracks were getting bigger. The echoes, as she called them, were no longer faint whispers. They were screams. Without thinking, her fingers went to the one thing that felt like an anchor. Tucked beneath her shirt, against her skin, was a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. A howling wolf, captured forever inside a perfect crescent moon. It was worn smooth with time, her only link to the before, her only clue. She squeezed it tight. The metal was cold against her warm skin, a small, solid piece of a puzzle she was terrified to solve. Maybe it was fate that she had this one piece of her past, or maybe it was a curse. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was afraid because she didn't believe she was the victim in these violent memories. She believed she was the monster. And what kind of monster has memories like that? The question hung in the empty apartment, a silent testament to the hollow space inside her own head, a space that was once a life. That unanswered question was the most terrifying thing of all, a hook that pulled her into every sleepless night.
The cold air of the Shadowlands burned in Kian's lungs, a clean fire that sharpened the senses and scoured the soul. This forest was his cage, his training ground, his penance. He moved through the ancient trees, a phantom in the twilight, his focus an unbreakable diamond. His mission was simple. His purpose was absolute. Vengeance. Every dawn, he awoke with his cousin's name, Valerius, a curse on his lips. Every day, he trained his 20 loyalists, honing them into a blade fine enough to slit a traitor's throat. Valerius had stolen his pack, his birthright, his life, all with poison-sweet lies and a treacherous alliance. So, Kian had made vengeance his new life. There was no room for anything else, not hope, not love, and certainly not distraction. But then the wind shifted. He froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. He tasted the air, pine, damp earth, the coming rain, and something else. Something impossible. Faint. Alien. The scent of city rain, stale coffee and fried food. A human scent. A taint on the purity of his wilderness. It was an irritation, a wrongness that set his teeth on edge. Yet, beneath the grime, something else called to him. A current of pure, clean fragrance softer than any forest flower. It was a scent of warmth, of belonging. It was a scent that didn't belong in his world of cold fury and discipline. In the span of a breath, the strange, alluring fragrance snagged in his mind, and for one terrifying second, it made him forget Valerius. The lapse was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a betrayal. With a low growl that was not entirely human, he shoved the phantom scent from his mind. It was nothing, a trick of the wind, a weakness he could not afford. More importantly, he had a war to plan, and every single part of him needed to be a weapon. He forced his focus back to the patrol route, his jaw tight. He was an alpha. He was the rightful heir of the Blood Moon Pack. He was a weapon being forged in the fires of exile. Even so, as he moved through the deepening shadows, a single disquieting thought remained. The wind was never wrong, which meant something was coming that he hadn't planned for. By the time the city bus hissed to a stop, Thea was a ghost haunting the edge of her own life. The job interview had been a disaster. Her meager savings were a whisper away from empty. Desperation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, threatening to crush what little hope she had left. She stood at the bus stop, the world a blurry gray smear, her exhaustion so complete it felt like she was drowning. Meanwhile, Kyan stood under the flimsy shelter of the bus stop, a hooded shadow amidst the evening commuters. This was a necessary risk, a dangerous but essential supply run into the city. His mission was simple: get the supplies, get out. He was a predator in a world of sheep, and his senses were on fire, screaming at the unnatural closeness of so many humans. And then he saw her. A woman, so drenched in exhaustion and sorrow she seemed to be fading into the rain. She was pale, fragile, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks. She was nothing, a human, a complication. But the moment their eyes locked, something inside him, the ancient beast he kept caged in discipline, lifted its head and growled a single, possessive word: mine. Thea didn't know what scared her more, the dizzying spell of hunger or the bone-deep weariness that was pulling her under. All she knew was that in the swirling chaos of her senses, one thing was solid. One thing was real. The man standing in the corner of the shelter. He was tall, broad, and radiated a quiet, dangerous strength that felt less like a threat and more like an anchor. As if pulled by a string, her body moved on instinct. She stumbled, a wave of dizziness washing over her, and her exhausted body slumped sideways, against his shoulder. The moment their skin made contact, everything changed. For Kian, it was a supernova of golden heat erupting from the point of contact, a searing pain, not of a burn, but of a forging. He saw it on his own arm, a glowing, intricate pattern of a wolf howling at a crescent moon, burning itself into his skin like a golden scar. His breath caught. It can't be. For Thea, it was a shocking, electric jolt that snapped her out of her daze. She felt a burning, tingling heat on her own shoulder, and a single, impossible word slammed into her mind, a word that felt more real than her own name: Alpha. She scrambled back with a strangled scream, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the glowing mark on his arm and knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that a matching one was now on her own skin. Panic, pure and absolute, seized him. A fated mate. Here? Now? He saw the terror on her face, heard the beginning of a scream that would bring the entire city down on them. His plans, his vengeance, his entire world. It was all about to shatter. Before she could move, before she could scream, he lunged. He wasn't just fast, he was a blur. One hand clamped over her mouth, muffling her scream, while the other arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. He hauled her from the shelter and into the mouth of the nearest dark alley, his body shielding her from view. The air thickened, charged with a power neither of them understood. Her heart hammered against his hand, a frantic bird in a cage. His own heart pounded in his chest, a war drum of shock and primal possession. "Be quiet," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through her entire body. "You have no idea what just happened." His mind was a storm, a chaotic, roaring tempest of instinct and fury. The golden mark on his skin was a brand of fate, a bond that screamed a single, possessive word into the core of his soul. Mate. But his mind, the cold, logical fortress he had built over years of exile, screamed another word. Impossible. In his arms, the woman was a whirlwind of terror, a fragile thing with the heart of a cornered hummingbird, beating frantically against his hand. He dragged her deeper into the alley's shadows, the wet brick scraping against his back. Her scent, that impossible mix of city grime and a deep, soul-stirring purity, was overwhelming his senses, making it hard to think. He had to make her understand. More importantly, he had to make her quiet before she brought his entire world crashing down. "Stop fighting me," he growled, the command rougher than he intended. The wolf inside him was pushing forward, a possessive beast that wanted to wrap itself around her and never let go. "Let me go. You're insane," she cried, her voice muffled against his palm. Her eyes, wide and dark in the dim light, were filled with a terror so profound it was like a physical blow. In fact, she was looking at him like he was the monster from her nightmares. Truth be told, he probably was. "I'm not going to hurt you," he tried, the words feeling clumsy and false in his mouth. How could he explain a sacred supernatural bond to a human who looked at him with such horror? What happened? It's a mark. It binds us. Her struggles only intensified. "You branded me. Who are you?" Time was running out. He could feel it. He made a choice. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but he had to break through her panic. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Look at me." Before she could move, he let the cage drop, just for a second. He let the wolf look out through his eyes. The pupils of his eyes bled from brown into a blazing, luminous gold. They weren't human. They were the eyes of a predator, ancient and wild, and they held her, pinned her, saw straight through her terror to the frantic, frightened soul beneath.
His eyes changed. One moment they were dark, angry, human. The next, they were golden. Not just golden, but glowing, lit from within by a terrifying, predatory fire. The world tilted. In the span of a breath, every rational thought in her head evaporated, replaced by a cold primal dread. The snarling from her visions echoed in her mind. The smell of pine. It was coming from him. Her body went completely still. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a shock so profound it was like being plunged into ice water. He was not human. The thought wasn't a question. It was a statement. A terrible, world-shattering truth. Her breath caught, trapped in her lungs. Seeing her frozen terror, the gold in his eyes receded, leaving them dark and shadowed once more. But the damage was done. The monster was real. "Now you see," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. "This is bigger than both of us. But right now you need to be quiet, and you need to trust me." Trust him? The silence stretched, thick with her unspoken terror. He was the thing from her nightmares made real. Trust was the one thing she could never, ever give him. Even so, she gave a stiff, jerky nod. What other choice did she have? Moments later, he seemed to be fighting a war inside his own head. He paced the length of the short alley like a caged animal, one hand running through his dark, wet hair while the other was clenched into a fist at his side. He kept glancing at her, and then at the glowing mark on his own arm, his expression a mask of torment. Deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something else entirely. Something ancient and strange and maybe, just maybe, something she was already a part of. Without warning, a new sound cut through the night. A distant, rising wail. Sirens. His head snapped up, his entire body going rigid. The time for deliberation was over. The look on his face was grim, final. Because of that sound, her world was about to end for a second time. "The police will find you," he said, his voice flat. "They'll ask questions. They'll see the mark. And by the time the sun rises, my enemies will know you exist." He pinned her with a stare that was heavy with a terrible, unspoken weight. "And they will come for you." She didn't know what scared her more, his words or the fact that she believed them. "You can't stay here," he stated, the words not a choice, but a verdict. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. The tension broke and her world narrowed to the determined, desperate look on his face. "You're coming with me." Before the words left her lips, before she could scream or fight or beg, his hand closed around her arm. His grip was like iron, strong and unyielding, yet beneath the strength, there was a strange, careful gentleness, as if he were afraid of breaking her. He pulled her out of the alley and into the rain-slicked street. The world rushed past in a blur of neon and wet pavement. Every person they passed was a ghost, a potential savior who didn't see the terror in her eyes, who didn't see the predator holding her arm. She was invisible. He led her to a beat-up dark green truck parked in the shadows, a relic that looked like it had survived a war. The moment he opened the passenger door, the scent hit her again. Pine and damp earth, the scent from her visions. Her blood ran cold. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the full-body tremor that seized her. This was real. This was happening. The moment the heavy truck door slammed shut, it was as if the world went silent. It plunged her into a near-total darkness, trapping her in the small cab with him. The sound was a final, damning thud. A coffin closing, a cage locking. And just like that, everything changed. The engine roared to life, a deep, angry rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing on the wet asphalt, and they were moving. She watched out the window as the familiar, grimy streets of Northgate flew by. The diner where she worked, the library she sometimes hid in, the park where she sat and felt lonely. All the small, sad pieces of the life she had cobbled together were being ripped away. Her prison, yes, but it was her known prison. Soon after, the last of the city lights flickered and died behind them, swallowed by an oppressive, absolute darkness. They were on a highway now, heading away from everything, plunging deeper and deeper into a wilderness that felt like it was waiting to devour them whole. She was alone, trapped in a metal box with a man who wasn't a man, a stranger who wore her nightmares on his skin and in his golden eyes, a man who claimed she was his. Her thoughts spun, a frantic, looping spiral of terror. He wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a piece of the puzzle, a piece of the before that had finally, violently found her. A cold, horrifying question took root in her heart, a hook that pulled her down into a new and even deeper abyss of fear. What if I'm not running from my past? What if he's taking me back to it? The truck stopped, and just like that, the world went silent. The angry rumble of the engine died, leaving a quiet so deep and profound it felt louder than any city noise. For a long moment, she didn't breathe. She just listened to the soft, rhythmic patter of rain on the metal roof and the frantic, wild beating of her own heart. This was it, the end of the road, the edge of the world. Without another word, Keon's door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold, damp air that smelled of wet earth and pine. It was the scent from her nightmares, and her breath caught in her throat. Her door opened next. He stood there, a tall, broad silhouette against a backdrop of towering black trees that looked like skeletal fingers scratching at the bruised purple sky. He wasn't looking at her with anger anymore, but with an unreadable, intense focus that was somehow worse. "Out," he commanded, his voice low and rough. Her body moved on instinct, numb and clumsy with dread. The moment her worn sneakers hit the muddy ground, she knew she was no longer in any world she understood. This was a place of predators. Before she could move, he took her arm again, and the now familiar jolt of heat from the mark on her skin shot through her. It wasn't painful, not anymore. But then, it was something else. A brand of ownership. A chain. He led her into a small clearing, and her world tilted. It was a camp, but not like any she'd ever seen. It was primitive, raw. Rough-hewn lean-tos were built against the massive trunks of ancient trees, their entrances covered with stretched animal hides. A large, crackling fire pit dominated the center, spitting orange embers into the misty air. And around that fire were the people, or what she assumed were people. There were maybe 20 of them, men and women, all dressed in practical worn leathers and furs. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly inhuman. When they turned to look at her, their faces were hard, their expressions a mixture of raw curiosity and undisguised hostility. And their eyes, in the flickering firelight, she saw it. A brief, terrifying flash of luminous gold, just like his. Her breath hitched. A growl rose in her throat. No, not her throat, from the shadows near a lean-to. It was a low, rumbling sound that was less a warning and more a promise of violence. Every instinct she possessed, every cell in her body screamed one word: run. But Kian's grip was an iron band on her arm. He ignored the stares, the growls, the palpable wave of menace. He just kept walking, pulling her through the heart of the camp as if he owned the very ground they walked on, which, she realized with a sickening lurch, he probably did. Kian! The voice was sharp, cutting through the tense silence. A man stepped forward, blocking their path. He was older than Kian, his face a road map of scars, his gray-streaked hair tied back from a hard, unforgiving face. He was big, broader even than Kian, and he looked at Thea as if she were something foul he'd found on the bottom of his boot. "What is this?" the man demanded, his eyes flicking from Thea's terrified face to Kian's hand on her arm. "This is my concern, Roman," Kian said, his voice flat and cold as steel. Roman's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, deliberately invading her space, and sniffed the air. It was a blatantly animalistic gesture, and it sent a fresh wave of terror through her. His lip curled in a sneer. "She is human." He said the word like a curse. "An alpha's first duty is to his pack. A human mate in a time of war?" He finally looked directly at Kian, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "She is a weakness, a liability we cannot afford." The tension broke. The space between the two men crackled with a power that felt like lightning about to strike. Thea felt it, clear as day. A brutal, primal challenge. Instead of answering, Kian simply turned and pulled her away toward one of the tents on the edge of the clearing. He didn't speak, didn't offer a single word of comfort or explanation. He just deposited her inside the dark, hide-covered tent, the scent of leather and him filling the small space. "Stay here," he ordered. Then he was gone, the hide flap falling closed, plunging her into a suffocating darkness. She was alone, a prisoner in a camp of monsters, claimed by a man who wasn't a man, and marked as a weakness by his entire pack. The nightmare wasn't a memory anymore. It was her new reality.
He saw the untouched tray of food outside her tent, and the cold knot of frustration in his gut tightened. For 2 days, she had barely eaten, barely spoken. She just sat in that tent, a ghost haunting the edge of his camp, her fear a palpable scent on the air that was driving his wolf insane. His responsibility to the pack was clear. Train, plan, prepare for war. He needed to be a weapon, cold and sharp. But this woman, his mate, she was a complication he couldn't solve with a blade. She was a puzzle whose pieces were scattered and lost. What's worse, Roman was right. In the eyes of his pack, she was a liability. A human. A vulnerability in his armor. But his wolf, the beast that lived and breathed for the bond, it saw her not as a weakness but as the one thing in his cursed life worth fighting for. He pushed aside the tent flap and stepped inside. She was huddled in the corner on a pile of furs, as far from the entrance as she could get. The moment she saw him, she flinched, her entire body coiling like a frightened animal. The sight of it sent a sharp, unfamiliar pang through his chest. It wasn't anger. It was an ache. He placed a fresh tray of roasted rabbit and bread near her. "You need to eat." The silence that followed was a wall between them, thick and heavy. He could see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find the right words. Alphas commanded. They led. They fought. They did not soothe. But the desperate primal urge to wipe the terror from her eyes was a force he couldn't ignore. So he did the only thing he could think of. He sat. Not on the furs next to her, but on the ground a few feet away, making himself smaller, less threatening. He just sat there in the quiet, sharing the small, dark space with her. As the silence stretched, he finally spoke, his voice low and rough. My father, he brought me into the Shadowlands when I was just a boy, to teach me to hunt. He looked at the wall of the tent, but he was seeing a memory. He wasn't a kind man. Strength was the only thing he respected. He paused, the memory a ghost on his tongue. I was small, and I was afraid. I missed a shot, wounded a doe. He was furious. He told me that a true alpha never shows weakness, never hesitates. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark with the weight of the past. He made me track that doe for a day and a night. He made me watch as she died slowly. He told me to remember her suffering, and that it was my fault. That was my first lesson in what it meant to lead. He didn't know why he told her that. It was a piece of himself he'd never shared with anyone, a moment of weakness, a story of shame. Maybe it was fate. Maybe he just wanted her to see that he wasn't just a monster. He was something else, something made, not just born. He watched as her gaze flickered from his face to the food. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and picked up a piece of bread, and she ate. It was the smallest of victories, a single fragile thread of trust in a sea of fear, but it was a start. But then, just as a flicker of something warm and unfamiliar sparked in his chest, a howl tore through the night. It wasn't one of his pack. It was a scout's warning. Lonely, mournful, urgent. The tent flap was thrown open, and Roman stood there, his face grim. Scouts, he barked, his eyes finding Kian. On the northern border. They carry the scent of silverwood. The name was a lit match on dry tinder. Kian's body went rigid. The fragile moment of peace shattered into 1,000 pieces, replaced by the cold, familiar promise of violence.
Kian was a storm of contained fury. The Silverwood pack, vicious, treacherous, and allied with his cousin Valerius, were sniffing at his borders. It was a probe, a test, and an insult that could not be ignored. He had led the patrol himself, a blur of righteous anger and deadly intent. Now they were back, but they were not victorious. They burst into the clearing carrying a boy, no older than 16, between them. It was Liam, young and eager and now screaming. A deep, poisoned gash ran down his leg, the flesh around it an angry, swollen black. The air thickened with the coppery tang of blood and the bitter scent of a poison Kian knew all too well. Thea, drawn from her tent by the commotion, watched from the shadows. Her heart ached for the boy, his cries of pain a sharp, physical agony in her own chest. Kian was a caged wolf, pacing helplessly as his healer, an old woman named Alara, worked frantically. The poison is too deep, Alara grunted, her face pale with strain. It's moving too fast. Liam let out another scream, his body arching in a spasm of pure agony. In that moment, something inside Thea shifted. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision. Her body moved on instinct as if pulled by a string she couldn't see. She pushed past the stunned warriors, ignoring their surprised grunts, and knelt beside the screaming boy. "What are you doing? Get back!" Roman snarled, reaching for her, but Kian's voice cut through the chaos, sharp as a whip. "Let her." He didn't know why he said it. He just knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had to see what she would do. Her breath trembled, her thoughts spun. She had no idea what she was doing, but her hands knew. Without thinking, She reached out and placed her palm flat on the boy's forehead. And just like that, everything changed. A soft, warm energy bloomed beneath her skin, a gentle, pulsing light that flowed from her chest, down her arm, and out through her palm. The boy's frantic screams softened to a whimper, his thrashing limbs going still. His panicked, pain-filled eyes found hers, and in them she saw a flicker of dawning peace. "The fever," Alara whispered in awe. "It's breaking." As the silence stretched, Thea felt the pull again, stronger this time, drawing her attention to the wound itself. She moved her other hand, hovering it just inches above the blackened, festering gash. She closed her eyes and focused, not on the warmth this time, but on a cool, cleansing feeling, like pure spring water. The change was visible. The angry black flesh seemed to recede, the swollen purple edges softening to a healthy pink. The foul scent of poison and decay lessened, replaced by the clean scent of healing. The entire camp was silent. Every eye was on her. They weren't looking at her with hostility anymore. They were looking at her with something else entirely: awe and fear. She pulled her hands back, a wave of dizziness washing over her as the energy receded, leaving her feeling drained and hollow. She looked up, her gaze finding Kian's across the fire. He was staring at her, his face a mask of utter, profound shock. The alpha, the warrior, the exiled leader. He was gone. In his place was a man looking at a miracle he couldn't comprehend. The quiet that followed was absolute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Liam's soft, even breathing. The space between them burned with 1,000 unspoken questions, but it was Kian who finally gave voice to the one that mattered most. His voice was a raw, stunned whisper that carried across the entire clearing. "What are you?" The silence that followed was a living thing. It was heavier than the darkness, thicker than the mist that curled around the edges of the camp. The awe in their eyes had curdled into something else, something sharper. Fear. Kian's question, "What are you?" hung in the air, a question she had no answer for. She was just Thea, a ghost, a collection of terrifying echoes, and now, apparently, something more. She retreated to her tent, her body trembling with a strange, humming exhaustion. She had saved the boy. She knew it with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying. But she had no idea how. The power that had flowed through her hands was a stranger, an unknown force living inside her own skin. To make things worse, the pack now watched her with a new, wary respect that felt more isolating than their previous hostility. She was no longer just a human liability. She was an unknown quantity, a mystery. And in a world of predators, mysteries were often seen as threats. That night, sleep did not come softly. It dragged her down into the deep, a violent undertow pulling her into the past. But then, for the first time, the dream was different. It wasn't a flash of pain and snarling. Instead, it was beautiful. She was standing in a forest blanketed in pristine moonlit snow. She wasn't wearing her worn city clothes. No, she was adorned in a ceremonial dress of pure white wool, intricately embroidered with silver thread that shimmered like captured starlight. She felt important. She felt cherished. Without warning, a sense of pure, unadulterated joy filled her. She wasn't afraid. She was home. She began to run, her bare feet kicking up clouds of powdery snow. And she wasn't alone. Wolves ran with her. Not terrifying monsters, but family. Massive, beautiful creatures of black and gray and silver, their paws silent on the snow, their breath misting in the cold air. She could feel their happiness, their exhilaration, a shared, wild freedom that sang in her blood. She wasn't just running with them. She was one of them. She belonged. The feeling was so powerful, so intoxicating, it brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had been missing, this connection, this pack, this life. The dream was a perfect crystalline moment of peace, until the voice shattered it. She refuses the Alpha's decree. The voice was a harsh, angry bark that cut through the joy like a jagged piece of glass. The world fractured. The beautiful wolves vanished. The feeling of belonging was ripped away, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of betrayal. She was suddenly standing in a circle of hard-faced men, their eyes cold and unforgiving. Pain exploded in her shoulder. The dream dissolved into the familiar chaos of blood and snarling, and she woke up with a scream trapped in her throat, the name a poisoned word on her lips. Silverwood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't just a random word. It was a name. It was the name of the beautiful, treacherous dream. It was a piece of the puzzle, a piece she had to understand. Because of that dream, she knew she couldn't hide in this tent any longer. She scrambled out into the pre-dawn chill, her mind racing. She had to find Kian. She had to tell him. Maybe it was fate that brought her here, to the one person whose enemies might hold the key to her own past. The name Silverwood was no longer just a nightmare. It was a destination. When she told him the name, a dangerous stillness fell over him. The word hung in the air between them, a bridge connecting his world of war and her world of shadows. "The Silverwood Pack," Kian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They are known for two things, their cruelty and their treachery." He watched her, his golden eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. "They are the ones who allied with my cousin. They are the reason my pack is broken." His words landed like stones, each one adding to the terrible weight in her chest. The people from her beautiful dream were his sworn enemies. For a full day, Kian was a ghost, consumed by thought. Thea felt the shift in the camp. The revelation of her healing power, combined with this new, damning piece of information, had turned her into a walking enigma. But Kian wasn't looking at her like a threat anymore. He was looking at her like a key. On the second morning, he came to her tent. "Come with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He led her out of the camp and into the deep woods, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. The forest was dense and silent, the ancient trees forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. It felt like they were walking into the heart of a forgotten world. After an hour, they arrived. Before them, on a windswept cliff overlooking a vast, misty valley, stood the ruins of an old stone watchtower. It was ancient, crumbling, wrapped in ivy and silence. The air here felt heavy with history, with the ghosts of forgotten words and broken promises. "This is the old border," Kian said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "For generations, the Blood Moon and Silverwood packs met here to forge treaties." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "And to break them. There is old magic in this place. Old memories." He took a step toward her. "I need to know what you remember. I need to know who you are." Her heart skipped. He was taking a massive risk, bringing her here. He was trusting that whatever she was, the truth was worth finding. That trust was a fragile, precious gift. As if pulled by a string, she walked toward the crumbling stone archway of the tower. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the moss-covered, ice-cold stone. The moment her skin made contact, the world exploded. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an echo. It was a memory. Full, violent, real. The stone is cold under her hands. She is wearing the white ceremonial dress. The Silverwood Alpha, a cruel, handsome man with eyes like chips of ice, is standing before her. He is smiling, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes. "You are a great asset to this pack, Omega," he says. "Your calming presence is a weapon, and Valerius of the Blood Moon will pay handsomely for such a weapon." Panic, cold and sharp, cuts through her. "No! A treaty cannot be sealed with a life." His smile vanishes. "You will do as you are commanded. You will be his mate. You will unite our packs. She looks at the circle of her packmates, the wolves she ran with, the family she loved, and sees nothing but cold, hard obedience in their eyes. The betrayal is a physical blow. I will not, she whispers. The words a death sentence. The alpha's face twists into a mask of fury. Then you are a traitor to your pack. He turns to his second in command. She knows too much. Erase her. The memory shattered. Thea collapsed, a strangled cry ripping from her throat. She was back at the ruins on her knees, the cold stone biting into her skin. The truth was a torrent, a flood of agony and betrayal that was drowning her. She wasn't just from the Silverwood pack. She was their omega, a prized asset, a pawn to be traded in a traitorous war. And they hadn't just exiled her. They had tried to murder her to cover their tracks. She looked up at Kian, her eyes wide with the horror of it all. The words tore from her, a ragged, broken whisper. I was one of them. His face, it was a mask of stone. But his golden eyes were a swirling vortex of shock, disbelief, and a deep, gut-wrenching betrayal. Not by her, but by fate itself. The universe had delivered him his fated mate, only to reveal that she was the daughter of his most hated enemy. Without thinking, he took a step back. A single, reflexive step away from her. And in that moment, her entire world, the fragile new world she had just started to build with him, crumbled into dust. The journey back to camp was a silent, agonizing trek through a frozen wasteland of their own making. The space between them, which had once crackled with a tentative, hopeful energy, was now a chasm of cold, hard truth. He didn't touch her. He didn't even look at her. She felt like a leper, a pariah. The truth she had so desperately craved had not set her free. Instead, it had branded her, marking her as the one thing this man, this pack, could never, ever accept: an enemy. When they arrived, the news of her identity swept through the camp like a plague. The awe she had earned was gone, replaced by the familiar, sharp-edged daggers of hatred and suspicion. Roman, his face a grim mask of vindication, stood before Kian, his voice low and dangerous. I told you she was a poison, Kian. A Silverwood spy sent to destroy us from within. The words were a physical blow, but Thea didn't flinch. What was there left to be afraid of? She had already lost everything, twice. But then, a spark ignited in the ashes of her despair, a tiny, flickering flame of defiance. She had been a victim for too long. She pushed past the other wolves and stood directly in front of Kian, forcing him to look at her. Her voice trembled, but it was clear and strong. Yes, she said, her gaze locked on his. I was a Silverwood. That is the truth. She took a ragged breath. But here is another truth. They betrayed me. They tried to kill me because I would not be a pawn in their game with your cousin. I am not your enemy. Her chest ached with the force of her words. I don't know what I am anymore. But I am not that. The entire camp held its breath. Kian looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the war raging inside him. His training, his history, his duty as an alpha. It all screamed that she was a lie, a trap. The poison of a generations-old blood feud was telling him to cast her out, to destroy her before she could destroy them. But his wolf, his soul, it was bound to hers. And the bond did not lie. He looked from her desperate, pleading face to the hard, unforgiving stare of his second-in-command. He looked at the faces of his pack, his family, who were demanding he choose. And he did. He took a step forward, deliberately, finally closing the chasm between them. He stood at her side, facing his pack, a king choosing his queen against the entire world. His voice, when he spoke, was not a command. It was a roar, a declaration that shook the very trees around them. Enough. Roman flinched as if struck. The entire pack went silent. Kian's golden eyes burned with an unholy fire. He looked at every single one of his warriors, his gaze an iron fist. But his next words were not for them. They were for her. He turned, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, his touch a searing brand of possession and promise. The world narrowed to the space between them. The fire in his eyes softened, replaced by a raw, fierce, and undeniable devotion. "I don't care what you were," he said, his voice a low, ragged vow that was meant for her soul alone. "I don't care what pack you came from, or what blood runs in your veins." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. The tension broke, and something new and powerful and unbreakable clicked into place between them. "I only care what you are, and you are mine."
In the stillness that followed his declaration, the world seemed to hold its breath. Kian's words, "You are mine," were not just a claim. They were a shield, a promise, a line drawn in the mud of a war-torn world. He felt every eye in the camp on them, 100 different currents of shock, doubt, and a grudging newfound respect. He had made his choice. And just like that, the entire war had a new center of gravity. Her. That night, he called a war council, not in the command tent, but around the main fire where all could see. He wanted no more whispers, no more shadows. He pulled Thea down to sit beside him on a log, a silent, unshakable statement. Roman sat opposite, his face carved from stone, his disapproval a palpable force field. "Valerius has been testing us for months," Kian began, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. "He sends scouts, poisons our patrols, and waits for us to rot in this exile. He thinks we are weak, broken." His eyes swept over his loyalists, the hard, desperate faces of wolves who had lost everything. "He is wrong." The tension broke as he continued. "His greatest strength is his alliance with the Silverwoods. They feed him supplies, they bolster his numbers, and they guard his western flank." He paused, then turned his gaze to Thea. "But now, we have an advantage he knows nothing about." Roman scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "A human advantage?" Before Kian could silence him with a growl, Thea spoke, her voice quiet, but clear as a bell in the firelight. "I am not human, not entirely, and I am not your enemy." She looked at Roman, her gaze steady without fear. "I am an Omega, and I know them. I know how they think." A murmur rippled through the pack. Kian felt a surge of fierce, protective pride. This was not the frightened ghost from the city. This was someone else, someone stronger. So he laid out the plan. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was an offensive strike against a Silverwood supply depot just beyond the northern border, an act of open aggression. "If we cut off his supplies," Kian finished, "we force him to move. We force him to make a mistake." "It's a suicide mission," Roman stated flatly. "Their patrols are unpredictable. We'd be walking into a trap." "No, we wouldn't," Kian said, his eyes finding Thea's. He was taking the greatest risk of his life, betting his entire war on a power he didn't understand, on a woman who was his sworn enemy by birth. He was betting on the bond. "Tell them what you told me." Thea closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight danced across her face, making her look ethereal, otherworldly. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the crackling flames. When she opened her eyes, they were unfocused, looking at something none of them could see. "There are 4 wolves on patrol tonight," she whispered, her voice a strange, distant echo. "They're bored, and they're cold. Their alpha is a man named Marcus. He is arrogant and overconfident." Her head tilted. "And he's cheating on his mate with a she-wolf from the supply camp." The entire pack stared, stunned into silence. "Their guard is down," Thea finished, her gaze finally focusing on Kian, sharp and clear. "They don't expect an attack, not tonight." The air thickened. Kian could feel the shift in his pack, the doubt warring with a dawning, reluctant hope. He stood up, his decision made. He was their alpha, and it was time he started acting like one who trusted his mate. "We move in 1 hour," he commanded. The discussion was over. He then turned to Thea, his voice dropping so only she could hear it, a low, intense murmur that was more intimate than any touch. "I'm trusting you with the lives of my pack." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shining in the firelight, and gave a single, determined nod. And in her eyes he saw not a Silverwood, not an enemy, but the woman who was about to help him win his war.
The night was a blur of shadows and steel. They moved through the forest like wraiths, a silent, deadly force. Kian was at the head, a predator in his element, but it was Thea who was their true guide. She didn't lead with a map, but with a feeling, a sixth sense that was as real and as vital as the air they breathed. 2 guards, to the left. "Behind that ridge," she would whisper, her hand on his arm. "They're talking, distracted." And she was always right. They bypassed patrols with an ease that felt like magic, slipping through the enemy's defenses like smoke through a keyhole. Kian had never felt so alive, so perfectly in sync with another being. It was as if her mind and his were 2 halves of the same weapon. They hit the supply depot hard and fast. The attack was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. There was no bloodlust, only brutal efficiency. They disabled the guards, destroyed the supplies, and set fire to the main tent. It was over in minutes. A perfect, flawless victory. The adrenaline of the fight, the thrill of their shared success, created a supercharged current between them. On the silent journey back to their own camp, their hands kept brushing, sending electric shocks through their bodies. The space between them burned with 1,000 unspoken words, 100 unanswered questions. That night, the camp celebrated. For the first time in months, there was laughter around the fire. There was hope. Even Roman gave Thea a grudging, respectful nod. She had proven herself. She was one of them. But Kian and Thea, they slipped away from the fire, away from the noise and the celebration. The tension that had been simmering between them for days had finally reached its boiling point. He led her to his tent, his hand finding hers in the darkness, their fingers lacing together in a way that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. Inside, the only light was a single lantern, casting their shadows long and dancing on the hide walls. He turned to her, his golden eyes blazing with an emotion that was too powerful to name. It was gratitude. It was awe. It was a desperate, all-consuming hunger that had been building since the moment she'd first slumped against his shoulder. "Thea." Her name was a raw, broken whisper on his lips. And just like that, the dam broke. She was in his arms, her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him down to her. His mouth crashed down on hers, a kiss that was not gentle or tender, but a raw, desperate claiming. It was the taste of victory, of survival, of a bond that defied bloodlines and blood feuds. The fire bloomed beneath her skin, a searing, wonderful heat that chased away the last of her ghosts. This was not a nightmare. This was real. His hands were in her hair, on her back, pulling her impossibly closer, as if he meant to fuse them together. Her world tilted, narrowing to the feel of his lips, the scent of pine and wood smoke in him, the solid, powerful wall of his chest against hers. Without breaking the kiss, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to the furs in the back of the tent. This was not a choice, it was an inevitability. It was the final, absolute surrender to a fate that had hunted them both down. Their clothes melted away, and then there was only skin on skin, heat on heat, a silent conversation of touch and taste and desperate aching need. In the quiet that followed, tangled together in the warm furs, Thea felt something she had never felt before in her entire fragmented life. Peace. She was home. But then, a commotion from outside the tent shattered the perfect stillness. It was Roman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Kian, the prisoner, he's talking." Kian rose, pulling on his trousers, a low growl rumbling in his chest at the interruption. Thea sat up, pulling a fur around her shoulders, a strange sense of foreboding chilling the warm afterglow of their passion. Moments later, Kian returned. The look on his face, it was a thundercloud of pure fury. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart starting to pound. "The prisoner," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He recognized you." Kian's eyes locked on hers, and what she saw in them made her blood run cold. "He says the Silverwood Alpha wasn't just trying to get rid of you. He says you weren't being punished for defiance." He took a ragged breath, the words tearing from him like shrapnel. "He said you were a prize, a gift, promised to Valerius to seal their alliance. The most powerful Omega in a generation, to be given to my cousin as a mate, and a broodmare." The air thickened, suffocating her. The beautiful, perfect peace of a moment ago was gone, poisoned by a new, even more hideous truth. Kian's face was a mask of cold, hard fury, but beneath it, she saw something else, a flicker of a new, terrible fear. He wasn't looking at her as a partner anymore. He was looking at her as the one thing that could bring his entire world to ruin. "They weren't just trying to kill you to cover their tracks," he whispered, the realization dawning on his face like a black sun. "They were trying to erase a stolen asset." He looked at her, his eyes wide with the horrifying implication. "And now Valerius knows I have you."
The victory celebration died like a snuffed flame. The laughter around the fire faded, replaced by the cold, heavy silence of a new reality. Thea was not just a runaway who had escaped a traitor's justice. She was a stolen prize, the most valuable piece on the entire board, and he had just sent up a flare, announcing to the world that he had her. For 2 days, the camp was a coiled spring of tension. Every warrior's senses were on high alert, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line, waiting for the inevitable response. Kian drilled them relentlessly, pushing them to their breaking points, because he knew that what was coming would be more than just a skirmish. It would be a slaughter. He and Thea, they moved around each other in a strange, new orbit of quiet desperation. The physical bond between them was now an unbreakable, searing chain, but the revelation had thrown a new wall up between them. He saw the way she looked at herself now, not as a survivor, but as a curse, a living, breathing reason for the coming war. And he was torn. Every time he looked at her, his wolf screamed mate, mine protect. But the alpha in him, the leader responsible for the lives of his people, saw the terrible strategic truth. Her very existence in his camp was a declaration of war. He had taken the one thing Valerius and the Silverwood Alpha wanted most. On the 3rd night, the whisper came. A scout, one of his best, stumbled back into camp, half dead and bleeding from a dozen wounds. He collapsed at Kian's feet, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. "A message," the scout choked out, pushing a crumpled, blood-stained piece of parchment into Kian's hand. Kian's hands trembled with rage as he smoothed it out. It wasn't a long message. It didn't need to be. It was written in Valerius's arrogant, elegant script, and it contained only 2 sentences. "You have something that belongs to me, cousin. I am coming to collect my property, and to burn the thieves who took her." The scout's last words were a ragged whisper before his eyes glazed over. "An army. Kian, they're marching with an army." The parchment crumpled in his fist. The time for hiding was over. The time for waiting was over. His gamble had failed. He hadn't forced a mistake. Instead, he had forced a war. He turned and faced his pack. They had all heard. He saw the fear in their eyes, but beneath it, he saw something else. A grim, hard-won resolve. They were exiles. They were the forgotten. But they were blood moon wolves. And they would not break. He found Thea standing by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire he had never seen before. She already knew. She had felt it. He walked to her, and in front of the entire pack he took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "We knew this day would come," he said, his voice ringing out through the silent clearing, a promise of iron and blood. "We will not hide in the shadows any longer." He squeezed her hand, a silent vow passing between them. He would protect her, or he would die. There was no other option. He turned to face his warriors, his mate at his side, his voice a roar that echoed through the entire valley, a challenge to the coming storm. "We will meet them, and we will break them." The sound came at dawn. It was not the call of a bird or the rustle of the wind. No, it was a sound of old cracked horn, a deep, mournful blast that echoed through the misty valley, a promise of death sent on the morning air. The sound ripped through the quiet hope of the camp, replacing it with the cold, hard certainty of battle. They were here. Kian didn't need to give an order. His wolves were already moving, their faces grim, their hands finding the hilts of their blades. He was not an alpha in that moment. He was a reckoning. His world narrowed to a single burning purpose. He would stand, he would fight, and he would die before he let them touch her. As if summoned by his thoughts, Thea was suddenly at his side. She wasn't wearing the frightened, haunted look of the ghost from the city. Instead, her face was pale, her jaw was set, and her eyes blazed with a defiant fire that mirrored his own. She held a short, wicked-looking dagger in her hand. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through his own rage. He looked at her, and his heart ached with a terrible, fierce love. For his pack, for his father's name, for the woman who had walked into his life and set it on fire. Then the first wave of attackers crashed through the tree line, and just like that, the world dissolved into a whirlwind of snarling, screaming, and the wet, percussive clang of steel on steel. Kian became the storm. He moved through the battle like a phantom, a blur of controlled fury. His blade was an extension of his will, a silver arc of death that met every enemy with brutal, final efficiency. But they were outnumbered. Hopelessly. For every one of Valerius's brutes they cut down, 2 more seemed to take their place, their faces twisted in snarling masks of bloodlust.
The battle was a living nightmare. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the sharp, acrid scent of pure, animalistic rage. The sounds, the roar of men, the snarls of wolves in midshift, the screams of the wounded, it all threatened to overwhelm her. But then she saw the makeshift infirmary where Alara was desperately trying to save the wounded. She saw the terror on the faces of the injured, the wild, pain-filled panic in their eyes. And something inside her shifted. Her own fear was a distant thing, a tiny flame next to the roaring inferno of her need to protect them. She ran. Not to the front lines, not with her small, useless dagger, but to the heart of the suffering. She knelt in the blood-soaked mud amidst the fallen, closed her eyes, and reached for the strange, quiet power within her. It answered her call. A wave of pure, calming energy flowed out from her, a silent, invisible shield against the chaos. It was a bubble of impossible peace in a world of violence. The screams of the wounded softened to whimpers. The frantic, terrified thrashing of the dying eased into a quiet stillness. She couldn't heal their wounds, not all of them, but she could ease their passing. She could give them peace. She was not a warrior. She was an Omega. And this was her battlefield. She was so focused, she didn't see him until it was too late. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, and her blood ran cold. Valerius. He was even more handsome than she could have imagined, and 10 times more cruel. He stood over her, a blood-splattered king surveying his conquest, a smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't looking at the battle. He wasn't looking at Kian. He was looking only at her, his eyes filled with a cold, possessive hunger. "So the runaway," he purred, his voice a silky, venomous caress, "has found a new master." His gaze was a physical violation, and behind him another figure stepped out from the trees. A man with eyes like chips of ice and a familiar, cruel smile. the Silverwood Alpha. Her Alpha. The sight of them together, the two architects of her stolen life, was the final terrible key. The world shattered. It wasn't a memory, not anymore. It was a reliving. The cold stone of the watchtower beneath her hands, the weight of the ceremonial dress, the faces of her packmates, cold and unforgiving. Her Alpha's voice, smooth as honey, poisonous as nightshade. You are a great asset, Omega, and Valerius of the Blood Moon will pay handsomely for such a weapon. I will not be a pawn. Then you are a traitor. Erase her. The full, agonizing truth crashed into her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She had been sold, betrayed, sentenced to death by the very people she had called family, all to seal a traitor's alliance. At the same time, Valerius's voice, dripping with triumphant venom, cut through the din of the battle, aimed like a poisoned arrow straight at Kian's heart. Did you really think she just appeared, cousin? She wasn't running from her past. He laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. She was a gift, a prize my Silverwood allies were bringing to me before the little thing got spooked and ran. Ask her. Her head snapped up. She saw Kian. He had cut his way through a half-dozen of Valerius's men and was now standing 20 feet away, his chest heaving, his blade dripping blood. But he wasn't looking at Valerius. He was looking at her. And his face. It was a mask of pure, shattered agony. He heard Valerius's words, and he saw the dawning, horrified recognition on her face. He saw the truth of her memory, but through the twisted lens of his cousin's lie, it looked like guilt. He saw a Silverwood. He saw a prize. He saw a lie. The bond between them, the beautiful golden thread that had woven their souls together, didn't just fray. It snapped. You knew, he choked out. The words not a question, but a verdict. A death sentence. The accusation, the utter lack of faith in his eyes, it destroyed her more than any blade ever could. He didn't see her. He saw her bloodline. He saw his enemy. And in that single, soul-crushing moment, he believed the lie. The battle raged around them, but they were in a silent, frozen world of their own. Then the world exploded back into motion.
With a roar of pure animalistic rage, Roman, Kian's scarred and loyal second, launched himself at Valerius, trying to buy his Alpha a moment. But he was outmatched. Valerius met his charge with a cruel, easy grace, his own blade flashing out, and Roman fell, a deep mortal wound in his chest. The sight of his friend falling, the poison of Valerius's lie, the agony of the broken bond, it was too much. Something inside Kian broke. The cold, disciplined leader vanished, and only the raw, wounded beast remained. He saw Thea, her face a mask of shock and despair, and in his blind pain he saw her not as his mate, but as the cause of it all. The reason his pack was dying, the reason Roman was bleeding out in the mud. He made a choice, the only one his broken mind could find. He created an opening. He shoved 2 of his own men toward the retreat path, then he turned on Thea, his face a snarl of grief and fury he would regret for the rest of his life. Go, he snarled, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the world. Go back to your kind. He turned his back on her. Deliberately, utterly. He turned his back on his mate, on his heart, on his own soul, and faced his cousin, his eyes dead, his stance a clear invitation for the final killing blow. He would hold them here. He would die here. And maybe, just maybe, his pack could escape. For a single eternal second, Thea stood frozen, trapped. The army of her betrayers was in front of her. The man who had just shattered her heart was behind her. There was nowhere to go. She was a ghost again, caught between 2 worlds that both wanted her dead or owned. Her instincts surged, not as an Omega, not as a Silverwood, but as a terrified, wounded animal. And she ran, not to Valerius, not back to the Silverwoods. Instead, she turned and fled into the deep, dark wilderness, away from the battle, away from the lies, away from the man with the dead golden eyes who had just ripped her world apart. She ran with nothing left but the full, agonizing weight of her past, and a heart that had been broken, completely and irrevocably for the very last time.
She ran, and the forest was a nightmare of grasping claws and tearing thorns. Branches whipped at her face, her clothes, her soul. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged, desperate sob. The mud sucked at her feet, trying to pull her down, trying to swallow her whole. Kian's words were a repeating echo, a dagger twisting in her heart with every frantic beat. Go back to your kind. Eventually, her body gave out. She collapsed at the base of an ancient, moss-covered oak, the rough bark biting into her back. The fight was gone. The hope was gone. There was nothing left. So, she wept. She wept for the life she couldn't remember, and for the one that had just been stolen from her. She wept for the boy in the battle and for the man who had turned his back on her. She wept until she was a hollow, empty thing, a shell washed up on the shore of her own despair. In the quiet that followed, something shifted. The tears stopped. The shaking subsided. She was at the bottom, the absolute rock-strewn floor of her own personal abyss. And from that place of utter emptiness, a single, quiet question rose. Is this all I am? A prize to be won? A curse to be broken? Without warning, a memory bloomed in her mind. Not the terror, not the betrayal, but the dream. The dream of running through the moonlit snow, a pack of beautiful, joyous wolves at her side. She remembered the feeling, the belonging, the freedom, the power. And then she remembered the infirmary, the feeling of cool, cleansing energy pouring from her hands, the sight of Liam's pained face softening into peace. Deep down, she knew the truth. That wasn't a curse. That was a gift. Her entire life, or what she knew of it, she had been defined by others, by the pack that betrayed her, by the man who couldn't trust her, by the cousin who saw her as property. They had all tried to put her in a cage, the victim, the prize, the spy, the weakness. But then, a new thought, sharp and clear as a shard of ice, cut through the fog of her grief. No more. Her power wasn't a calming presence to be used as a weapon by cruel men. It was a connection, a force of pure, unadulterated truth. And the world that Valerius and her former alpha had built, it was a world of lies. A cold, serene strength filled her, chasing away the last of the despair. She was not a victim to be saved or a prize to be claimed. She was an Omega. And she finally understood what that meant. Her goal was no longer to run. Her goal was no longer to survive. Her goal was to end this. As if the forest watched her transformation, the rain softened to a gentle mist. She got to her feet, her movements no longer clumsy with fear, but steady and deliberate. She knew where Valerius would go. He was a creature of ego and spectacle. He wouldn't just kill Kian. He would make a show of it. He would take him to the old ceremonial grounds, the sacred heart of the Blood Moon Pack. And she, the ghost they all thought was broken and gone, would be waiting for them. She turned, not back the way she came, but on a new path, a direct line toward the heart of the conflict. She was no longer running from the fire. She was walking into it.
Darkness, and the cold, biting kiss of iron chains on his wrists. The world had shrunk to this small, damp cave, the air thick with the smell of his own blood and the suffocating stench of defeat. He didn't struggle. What was the point? He had lost. He had lost his pack, his birthright, and his soul. He had looked into the eyes of his mate, his other half, and he had cast her out. The memory of the look on her face. That was a wound far deeper than any blade could make. He was a failure, a fraud, an alpha who had let fear, that old poison, rule him at the final moment. The sound of footsteps echoed in the cave. Valerius appeared, a torch in his hand, his handsome face a mask of triumphant glee. He was flanked by the Silverwood Alpha, whose icy eyes held a flicker of unease. "Quite the mess you made, cousin," Valerius purred, circling him like a vulture. "But don't worry. I'll take good care of your pack, and your little Omega prize once we hunt her down." Kian didn't even look at him. He just stared at the damp stone floor, waiting for the end. "Leave him," Valeria said to the guards. "Let him contemplate his failures." Then he turned to a figure slumped in the corner, a figure Kian hadn't even noticed in his haze of despair. "And leave the traitor with him. Let them die together." They left, plunging him back into near darkness. But he wasn't alone. A weak, rattling cough came from the corner. "Roman," Kian whispered, his voice cracking. He crawled across the floor, the chains clinking, until he reached his friend. His second. The man who had followed him into exile without question. Roman was lying in a pool of his own blood, his breathing a shallow, painful rasp. "Alpha," Roman choked out, a bloody smile twisting his lips. "Don't speak," Kian said, his voice thick with a grief so profound it was a physical weight. "Save your strength." "No time." Roman's eyes, glazed with pain, found his. "You need to. Listen." He coughed again, a spray of red misting the air. "I saw it, Kian. During the battle, I saw the Silverwood Alpha give the order." Kian froze. He called her a traitor. Roman gasped, his voice a fading whisper. "He said she was a traitor, for refusing you, for refusing Valerius. He ordered her death." Roman's hand, slick with blood, fumbled for Kian's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "The bond doesn't lie, Kian," he whispered, his eyes boring into Kian's, filled with a desperate, dying urgency. "Only fear does. I was afraid of what she was. Don't let it destroy you." And with a final, rattling sigh, Roman was gone. The truth slammed into Kian with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his pride, his rage, his despair. Roman was right. The bond had never lied. It had screamed mate innocent hours. But he had listened to the old voices, the voice of his father, the voice of his duty, the voice of fear. He hadn't just failed her. He had betrayed her. He had betrayed the most sacred thing in their world. And in doing so, he had become the very thing he despised. A monster. A new goal ignited in the ashes of his soul. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about his pack or his name. It was about her. He had to earn her forgiveness, even if it was the very last thing he ever did. As if on cue, a new sound began, the slow, heavy, rhythmic beat of a single, massive drum. Thump, 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 the sound of his own execution. Valerius dragged him into the center of the ceremonial grounds, a wide circular clearing surrounded by ancient, moss-covered standing stones. The combined packs of the Blood Moon and Silverwood wolves were gathered, their faces a sea of grim, expectant expressions. Kian didn't fight. He walked with his head held high, his chains clinking with every step. He was no longer a man waiting to die. He was a man with a final purpose. His eyes scanned the crowd, not for an escape, but for a ghost, for a flash of dark hair and defiant eyes. But she wasn't there. "Behold," Valerius shouted, his voice ringing with false triumph. "Kian, the so-called true Alpha, a traitor who brought a Silverwood spy into our midst, a weakness that has cost us so many lives." He basked in the roars of his followers, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. "And the Omega prize?" he continued, raising his hands for quiet. "She has seen the error of her ways. She has abandoned this failure and will soon return to me her rightful—" His words died in his throat. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Every head turned, every eye widened, because she was there. She walked out from between two of the ancient standing stones, emerging from the forest not as a runaway or a captive, but as something else entirely. She was not armed. She was not flanked by warriors. She was alone. And she was radiating a serene, otherworldly calm that was more powerful than any weapon. Her eyes, clear and bright, swept over the crowd, over Valerius, over her former Alpha, and then they locked with Kian's. And in that single shared glance 1,000 words were spoken. Forgiveness, regret, and a promise of a reckoning to come. The Silverwood Alpha, his face pale with panic, seeing his entire web of lies about to be unraveled, finally broke. "She's the traitor!" he screamed, his voice shrill with fear. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Seize her! Seize the traitor!" A half-dozen of his personal guard started to move, their blades drawn. The crowd held its breath. Kian's muscles tensed, ready to fight, to die, to buy her even a single second. But Thea did not run. She did not flinch. She did not even look at the advancing guards. Instead, she simply stopped in the very center of the clearing. She closed her eyes. And she unleashed the truth.
The world held its breath. The guards hesitated, their blades half raised, their faces a mixture of confusion and menace. The clearing was a tinderbox, and the Silverwood Alpha's scream was the lit match. But then, Thea did not raise a weapon. She did not utter a single word. Instead, she unleashed a force more powerful than any army. A tidal wave of pure, silent truth. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A memory. Her memory. It washed over the clearing, a psychic flood that poured into the mind of every single wolf present. They saw it all. They saw her running through the moonlit snow, a joyous Omega with her pack. They felt the sting of her alpha's betrayal, the cold, calculating words that sold her like property. They felt the terror as she refused the decree, the agony of her own packmates turning on her. They felt the sharp, brutal pain of the blade that was meant to end her life. And they felt the lonely, hollow fear of a ghost waking up in a world she didn't know. The guards stopped, their swords lowered, their faces slack with a dawning, horrified understanding. The hard-faced Silverwood warriors who had hunted her. They looked at their own alpha, their expressions curdling from loyalty into disgust. The Blood Moon wolves. They looked at Valerius, and for the first time, they saw him not as a strong leader, but as a cowardly traitor who had allied himself with murderers. The web of lies, the poison that had fueled this entire war, was not just unraveled, it was burned to ash.
The moment the wave hit him, it was not a memory but a confirmation. He felt her truth, her innocence, her agony, and it was a fire that scoured the last of his own shame, replacing it with a cold, righteous fury. He saw the shock on Valerius's face, the pure animal panic in the Silverwood Alpha's eyes, and he saw his opening. With a roar that was pure, untamed alpha, he shattered the iron chains on his wrists as if they were made of glass. The guards between him and Valerius were no longer a threat. They were a nuisance. He threw them aside like dolls, his path now clear. Valerius, his face pale with terror, drew his own blade, his arrogance finally cracking. "You are beaten, cousin. This changes nothing." Kian didn't answer with words. He answered with action. The fight was not a duel. It was a judgment. Valerius was skilled, yes, but he fought with vanity, with flair. Kian fought with the weight of his entire world, with the soul of his pack, with the love of his mate fueling every move. He was not a brawler. He was a force of nature. Clang, parry, twist. He moved inside his cousin's guard, his movements a blur of deadly grace. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to dismantle. He broke Valerius's guard, then his pride, then his will. In the end, Valerius's sword went spinning into the dirt. Kian's blade was at his throat. The entire clearing was silent, watching, waiting for the killing blow. But Kian was no longer the man who had been consumed by vengeance. He had been reborn in the fire of his own failure. Instead of taking his cousin's life, he simply looked at him, his golden eyes filled not with hatred but with a cold, final pity. He pulled his blade back. "You are no alpha," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the clearing. "And you are no longer Blood Moon." He turned his back on his defeated cousin, a final, absolute dismissal. His war for vengeance was over. His fight for her had just begun.
In the quiet that followed, the world began to right itself. The Silverwood Alpha, seeing his power evaporate, made a desperate run for the forest. But his own warriors, their faces masks of cold fury, stepped in his path. They surrounded him, their blades drawn, their judgment silent and absolute. They would deal with their own traitor. As for Valerius, he was on his knees in the dirt, a broken man, his followers already melting away from him like snow in the spring sun. But Kian only had eyes for one person. He walked across the clearing, his steps slow, deliberate. The entire world seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them, standing in the center of the ancient, silent stones. He stopped a few feet in front of her, and she saw the raw, agonizing truth in his eyes. He was as broken as she had been. Her heart ached for him, for both of them. Then, he did something that shattered every rule of their world. He, the alpha, the victor, the rightful leader of two packs, he sank to his knees before her. In the dirt, in front of everyone. His head was bowed, a gesture of complete and utter surrender. "I failed you," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing, thick with a shame that tore at her soul. "When you needed me most, I listened to fear. I believed the lie." His golden eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, finally lifted to meet hers. "Can you ever forgive me?" The silence was absolute. Every wolf was watching. This was more than an apology. This was a rewriting of their world. An alpha did not kneel. An alpha did not beg. But then, Thea did something just as impossible. She knelt in front of him, her own knees sinking into the mud until they were at eye level. The world narrowed to the space between them. Her hands, no longer trembling, came up to gently cup his face. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. With a love so powerful it felt like it could heal the entire world. "We were both lost," she whispered, her thumbs brushing away the tears that now tracked through the dirt on his cheeks. "But now, we're found." And she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of peace. A promise of a new beginning, sealed not in blood, but in forgiveness. Weeks later, the ceremonial grounds were no longer a place of judgment, but of rebirth. The sound of hammers on wood had replaced the sound of swords on shields. The honorable wolves of both the Blood Moon and Silverwood packs, their old allegiances broken by the truth, were working together, building a new unified settlement under the watchful eyes of the ancient stones. Kian was not a king. He was a leader. He worked alongside them, his shoulders bearing the weight of not just his people, but a new fragile peace. Thea stood on the high ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge where Kian had once planned a war. The cool morning air was crisp and clean, and the sky was painted in the soft, hopeful colors of a new dawn. She was no longer haunted by nightmares. The echoes were gone, replaced by the quiet, steady strength of a woman who finally knew who she was. She heard his footsteps on the rock behind her, slow and familiar. Her soul answered before she even turned. He came to stand beside her, not speaking, his presence a warm, solid comfort in the cool air. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her into his side. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture as natural as breathing. It was the same touch that had started it all, at a lonely bus stop in a forgotten city. But this time, it was not an accident of fate. It was a choice. "It's beautiful," she whispered, watching the sun crest over the distant mountains, its golden light spilling into the valley, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Not as beautiful as you," he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble against her ear. He kissed the top of her head, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated love. They stood there for a long time, in comfortable silence, watching their new world wake up. His war was over. Her past was found. Their future was a blank page, as bright and full of promise as the rising sun. And just like that, everything was finally, truly okay.